life. She sneered, "Medical bills are expensive, time to pay up." Her husband added, "Sick kids are financial burdens." I handed her a black envelope and watched her face pale when she learned I owned the entire building and every property she'd been living in for free. That morning, she didn't just lose control of my apartment, she lost everything. I never thought I'd be writing this story, but here I am, sitting in my lawyer's office, watching my sister Megan sign document after document while her husband Andrew sits beside her looking like he's aged 10 years in the past month. I suppose I should start from the beginning, because this tale of revenge is one that's been brewing for years, culminating in the most satisfying morning of my entire life. My name is Emily, and until recently, I thought I knew what family meant. I'm 34 years old, a single mother to my beautiful 8-year-old daughter Naomi, and for the past 3 years, I've been living in what I believed was my sister's apartment building in downtown Chicago. Megan is 2 years older than me, and she's always been the golden child in our family. Where I struggled through community college while working 2 jobs, she sailed through Northwestern on our parents' dime. Where I got pregnant young and had to figure out single motherhood, she married her college sweetheart Andrew and lived what seemed like a charmed life. But appearances, as I've learned, can be devastatingly deceiving. 3 years ago, when Naomi was 5 and I was barely scraping by as a medical billing specialist, Megan approached me with what seemed like a generous offer. She claimed she was managing a small apartment building and had a vacant unit. The rent was reasonable at $1,950 a month for a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood with good schools. It was more than I was paying for our cramped 1-bedroom across town, but Megan insisted it was a family discount, and that she wanted Naomi to have a better environment to grow up in. I was hesitant about mixing family and business, but Megan was persuasive. "Emily, you're my sister," she'd said, her voice dripping with what I thought was genuine concern. "I want to help you and Naomi have a better life. Besides, having family as tenants means I don't have to worry about rent payments or property damage. It's a win-win situation." So we moved in. The apartment was lovely, with large windows that let in plenty of natural light, hardwood floors that Naomi loved to slide across in her socks, and a small balcony where we'd eat breakfast on weekends. For the first time in years, I felt like we were finally getting ahead. Naomi enrolled at the local elementary school and made friends quickly. I was able to walk to work, saving money on gas and parking. Life seemed to be looking up. Megan would stop by occasionally, always unannounced, claiming she was just checking on the property. She'd inspect the apartment with a critical eye, making notes about minor scuff Andrews on the walls or questioning me about the noise level from our upstairs neighbors. I found it odd but attributed it to her being a new landlord, still learning the ropes of property management. Andrew, her husband, rarely came around, but when he did, he had this unpleasant habit of making comments about the burden of maintaining rental properties and how tenants never understood the costs involved. He worked in finance, something high-level that he never fully explained but that apparently paid well enough for them to live in a beautiful house in Lincoln Park while driving matching BMW sedans. Everything changed 8 months ago when Naomi started getting sick. It began with what we thought was just another childhood illness, fatigue, loss of appetite, occasional fevers. But when she started losing weight and bruising easily, I knew something was seriously wrong. The pediatrician ran blood tests, and the results came back with numbers that made my world tilt sideways. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words hit me like a physical blow, and I remember sitting in that sterile doctor's office, holding Naomi's small hand while she asked why everyone looked so sad. She was only 8 years old, and she was facing a battle that no child should ever have to fight. The next few months became a blur of hospital visits, chemotherapy sessions, and sleepless nights spent researching treatment options and survival rates. Naomi was incredibly brave, braver than I could ever be, but watching your child suffer while being unable to take their pain away is a special kind of hell that no parent should experience. My job as a medical billing specialist, ironically, helped me navigate the insurance maze, but even with decent coverage, the medical bills started mounting. Co-pays, out-of-network specialists, experimental treatments not covered by insurance, travel costs for treatments at specialty hospitals, it all added up faster than I could have imagined. I started working extra hours whenever Naomi was stable enough for me to leave her with my neighbor Mrs. Peterson, an elderly woman who had become like a grandmother to Naomi. I depleted my savings account, maxed out my credit cards, and even started a small fundraising campaign that raised a modest amount from friends and coworkers. Still, it wasn't enough. The financial stress was overwhelming, but I told myself that money was just money, Naomi's life was priceless, and I'd figure out the rest later. Through all of this, Megan's behavior became increasingly strange. She'd call me at odd hours, not to ask about Naomi's condition, but to complain about imaginary issues with the apartment. She claimed the neighbors were complaining about noise, though I spent most of my time at the hospital and Naomi was too sick to be running around making noise. She started showing up with a tape measure, claiming she needed to verify square footage for insurance purposes. When I asked her to schedule these visits in advance, she became defensive and accused me of being difficult. The final straw came 3 weeks ago. Naomi had been in the ICU for 5 days following a severe reaction to her latest round of chemotherapy. The doctors weren't sure if she was going to make it through the weekend, and I hadn't left the hospital except to shower and change clothes. I was surviving on coffee and vending machine food, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside Naomi's bed, and praying to whatever higher power might be listening. That's when Megan decided to visit me at the hospital. I was sitting beside Naomi's bed, holding her tiny hand and watching the monitors that tracked her vital signs, when Megan appeared in the doorway. Naomi was sedated, connected to multiple machines that beeped and hummed constantly. The sight of my normally vibrant daughter looking so small and fragile in that hospital bed was heartbreaking, and I expected my sister to show some compassion, some understanding of what we were going through. Instead, Megan barely glanced at Naomi before launching into what she'd apparently come to say. "Emily, we need to talk about your rent situation," she announced, her voice lacking any warmth or empathy. "Your lease is up for renewal next month, and there are going to be some changes." I stared at her in disbelief. "Megan, this really isn't the time. Naomi is fighting for her life, and..." "Which is exactly why we need to discuss this now," Andrew interrupted, appearing behind her, his voice cold and businesslike. "Medical bills are expensive, Emily. We know you're struggling financially, and we can't afford to subsidize your living situation anymore." "Subsidize?" I repeated, confused. "I pay my rent on time every month. I've never been late, not once in 3 years." Megan's expression hardened. "You've been paying below Andrew A rate this entire time as a favor to family. But circumstances have changed. The Andrew A has shifted, and we need to adjust accordingly." She pulled out an official-looking document from her purse and handed it to me. "Your new rent will be $5,900 per month, effective immediately upon lease renewal. That's the current Andrew A rate for a 2-bedroom apartment in that neighborhood." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Nearly $6,000 a month? That was more than I made in most months, even with overtime. "Megan, that's impossible. You know I can't afford that, especially now. Naomi's medical bills. Medical bills are expensive, time to pay up," Megan sneered, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You should have thought about the financial implications before letting your daughter get sick." Andrew nodded in agreement, his expression utterly without compassion. "Sick kids are financial burdens, Emily. That's just the reality of the situation. We can't let your poor planning affect our bottom line." I felt rage building inside me like I'd never experienced before. These people, my own sister and her husband, were standing outside my daughter's hospital room, literally while she was fighting for her life, and demanding that I pay nearly $6,000 a month in rent. They were treating Naomi's illness like it was somehow my fault, like I had chosen for my child to have cancer. "Get out," I said quietly, my voice trembling with fury. "Emily, be reasonable," Megan started. "Get out," I screamed, not caring that we were in a hospital, not caring that other families could hear me. "Get out of here right now before I call security and have you removed." They left, but not before Megan dropped the lease renewal papers on the nearby chair. "You have 30 days to decide," she said coldly. "Pay the new rate or find somewhere else to live. Family discount is over." After they left, I sat there shaking with anger and disbelief. How could my own sister be so cruel? How could she look at Naomi lying there sedated and make demands about money? I wanted to cry, to scream, to somehow make them understand the pain they'd just caused, but Naomi needed me to be strong. That night, after Naomi's condition had stabilized and she'd been moved to a regular room, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my lawyer, Helen Rodriguez, whom I'd worked with years ago during Naomi's custody arrangements with her father. Helen had always been straight with me, and I trusted her completely. "Helen, I need you to run a property search for me," I said during our phone call. "I need to know who actually owns the building I'm living in." "Emily, what's going on?" Helen asked, concern evident in her voice. I explained the situation, and Helen was appropriately horrified. "I'll run the search first thing tomorrow morning," she promised. "But Emily, even if your sister doesn't own the building, she can't just triple your rent like that. There are tenant protection laws. Just run the search, Helen. I have a feeling there's more to this story than what Megan's been telling me." The next morning, Helen called me back with information that made my blood run cold. "Emily, you need to sit down for this. The building you're living in isn't owned by your sister. It's owned by Davis Holdings LLC, which is registered under a trust for Naomi Davis Morrison. Your daughter." The world stopped spinning. I felt like I couldn't breathe. "What are you talking about, Helen? Naomi's 8 years old. She can't own property. The property was purchased 3 years ago and placed in a trust for Naomi's benefit, with you listed as the trustee." "But Emily, According to these documents, you were supposed to be contacted and involved in establishing this trust. The trust was funded by a settlement from Davis Industries. Davis Industries. Naomi's father's company. Tom Davis, who had walked out on us when Naomi was 2 years old, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility of fatherhood. Tom, who had missed every birthday, every Christmas, every important moment in Naomi's life. Tom, whose wealthy family had apparently decided to assuage their guilt by setting up a trust fund for the granddaughter they'd never bothered to meet. Helen, I never knew about any of this. I never signed any documents establishing this trust, never received any notices. That's because all the initial paperwork shows signatures that appear to be yours, but looking at them now alongside your actual signature, they appear to be forgeries. The address on file for correspondence is in Lincoln Park. Emily, that's your sister's address. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. Megan had somehow intercepted the initial communications about Naomi's trust and forged my signature to establish herself as the intermediary. She'd been collecting rent from me, rent on a building that Naomi actually owned, for 3 years. Not only that, but she'd been living in her expensive Lincoln Park house rent-free because, according to the property records Helen was reading to me, that house was also owned by Davis Holdings LLC. Helen, how much money are we talking about here? The trust was initially funded with $8 million, invested in various properties around Chicago. The current value, including appreciation and rental income from the properties. Emily, you're looking at close to $12 million. I had to sit down. My legs simply wouldn't support me anymore. For 3 years, while I'd been struggling to make ends meet, while I'd been working overtime and stressing about every medical bill, my daughter had been a millionaire. Meanwhile, my sister had been living a life of luxury funded by money that belonged to Naomi. Helen, I need you to do something for me. I need you to prepare eviction notices for every property owned by Davis Holdings LLC. I want everyone out who shouldn't be there, including Megan and Andrew. And I want criminal charges filed for fraud, forgery, and whatever else applies. Emily, are you sure about this? This is going to tear your family apart. My family was torn apart the moment my sister stood outside my dying daughter's hospital room and demanded $6,000 in rent. Do it, Helen. Do all of it. The next week was a whirlwind of legal activity. Helen worked with forensic accountants to trace exactly how much money Megan had stolen from Naomi's trust. The number was staggering, over $280,000 in rental income that should have been going into Naomi's account, plus the value of the free housing she'd been providing herself and Andrew. What made the betrayal even worse was discovering the extent of Megan's deception. During those 3 years, every time I'd struggled to make rent payments, which was more often than I'd like to admit, Megan had acted like she was doing me this enormous favor by accepting late payments or allowing me to pay in installments. She'd lecture me about responsibility and financial planning, all while knowing that the money I was desperately scraping together to pay her was actually money that should have been managed for Naomi's benefit. I remembered specific instances that now took on a completely different meaning. There was the time Naomi needed emergency dental work after falling off her bike, and I'd asked Megan if I could pay rent a week late to cover the dental bills. She'd made such a production of considering my request, finally agreeing but warning me that she couldn't make exceptions regularly. She'd actually had the audacity to charge me a $50 late fee, $50 that came out of my grocery budget that week, for the privilege of accessing money that belonged to Naomi's trust. Or the time my car had broken down and I'd asked if I could pay half the rent up front and half the following week when I got paid. Megan had agreed, but only after a lengthy lecture about how property management was a business and she couldn't run a charity. She'd made me feel grateful for her generosity while literally stealing from Naomi's inheritance. The forensic accountants also uncovered something that made my blood boil. Megan had been claiming tax deductions for property management services and below Andrew A. rental assistance she was supposedly providing. She'd been writing off thousands of dollars annually by claiming legitimate business expenses for managing properties that she had no legal right to manage. Not only was she stealing Naomi's money, but she was also using our situation to reduce her own tax burden while living rent-free in properties Naomi owned. Helen showed me copies of Megan's tax returns, and I had to sit down when I saw the numbers. Megan had claimed over $25,000 in questionable deductions over 3 years, all based on her fraudulent management of Naomi's trust properties. The irony was nauseating. She was claiming tax benefits for managing properties while simultaneously planning to exploit the true owner's mother. But perhaps the most heartbreaking discovery was a series of emails between Megan and Andrew that the forensic team uncovered. These emails, dating back to just after Naomi's diagnosis, revealed the true depth of their callousness. In one particularly cruel exchange, Andrew had written, "The kids' medical bills are going to bankrupt Emily eventually. We should start planning for when she can't pay rent anymore. Maybe we can use her desperation to our advantage." Megan had responded, "I've been thinking the same thing." She's so focused on the kid that she's not paying attention to anything else. This could be our opportunity to finally cash out on this property situation. We've been too generous for too long. Another email, sent just 2 weeks before their hospital visit, showed Megan calculating exactly how much rent she could demand. Andrew, a rate for that unit is actually closer to $6,200, but I think $5,900 will sound more reasonable. She'll be desperate enough to agree to anything to keep from having to move Naomi during treatment. We can always raise it again in 6 months. Andrew's reply was even worse, perfect. Her desperation is our opportunity. Sick kids are expensive, and we shouldn't have to subsidize her poor family planning. It's time for Emily to learn that life has consequences. Reading these emails felt like being stabbed repeatedly. These weren't strangers plotting against us, this was my sister and her husband, people who had sat at Naomi's birthday parties, who had held her when she was a baby, who had claimed to love her. They had seen Naomi's diagnosis not as a tragedy requiring family support, but as a business opportunity to exploit. The emails also revealed that Megan had been researching Naomi's medical condition specifically to calculate how much financial pressure I could handle. She'd looked up average treatment costs for childhood leukemia, average survival rates, and typical family financial impacts. She'd literally been using my daughter's cancer diagnosis as Andrewy research for her exploitation scheme. Helen was incredulous when she showed me these documents. Emily, I've been practicing law for 20 years, and I've never seen anything this cold-blooded between family members. This isn't just theft, this is calculated psychological torture designed to exploit your love for Naomi. The investigation also revealed that Megan and Andrew had been living far beyond what their actual incomes could support. Andrew's finance job, while well-paying, wasn't nearly as lucrative as they'd made it seem. They'd been using the free housing and stolen rental income to maintain a lifestyle that included expensive vacations, luxury cars, designer clothes, and regular expensive dinners at high-end restaurants. Their social media posts from the past 3 years now looked obscene in context. Photos of them in Italy, claiming they were living their best life. Pictures from expensive ski trips to Aspen, with captions about working hard and playing harder. Images of Megan wearing jewelry that cost more than I made in months, while I was clipping coupons and buying generic groceries to make ends meet. The most infuriating post was from just 2 months before Naomi's diagnosis. Megan had shared a photo of their new BMW, with the caption, "Sometimes you have to invest in yourself and stop subsidizing other people's poor decisions." #self-care isn't selfish #financial wisdom. She'd literally been bragging about refusing to help others while stealing money that belonged to my daughter. Helen's team also discovered that Megan had been spreading lies about our family situation to mutual friends and extended family members. She'd been telling people that I was financially irresponsible, that I was taking advantage of her generosity, and that she was worried about Naomi growing up with such a poor example of financial management. Our cousin Lisa later told me that Megan had approached her at a family wedding, expressing concern about my spending habits and asking if Lisa thought someone should intervene before I ruined Naomi's future. The irony was suffocating. Megan was stealing Naomi's actual future while pretending to be concerned about my parenting. But what really broke my heart was learning about the opportunities Naomi had missed because of Megan's theft. The trust was supposed to provide not just basic living expenses, but also educational opportunities, cultural experiences, and the kind of childhood enrichment that money can provide. Naomi could have been attending private schools with smaller class sizes and better resources. She could have had tutors, music lessons, art classes, travel experiences, and all the advantages that her biological father's family had intended for her to have. Instead, Naomi had been growing up thinking we were poor, watching me stress about every expense, feeling guilty when she needed new clothes or school supplies. She'd been living in a smaller apartment than she was entitled to, attending schools that were good but not great, missing out on opportunities that were rightfully hers. The trust documents showed that the Davis family had specifically intended for Naomi to have the best possible education, comprehensive healthcare, and cultural experiences that would broaden her horizons. They'd wanted her to grow up knowing she had options, knowing she could pursue any dream without financial limitations. Instead, she'd been growing up watching her mother work multiple jobs and stress about medical bills. I also learned that there had been several attempts by the Davis family's lawyers to contact me directly over the years. They'd wanted to establish a relationship with Naomi, to ensure the trust was being properly managed, and to discuss Naomi's future educational and medical needs. All of these attempts had been blocked by Megan, who had convinced them that she was handling communications on my behalf based on my supposed preferences for privacy. The Davis family's lawyers had actually questioned some of Megan's decisions, particularly her claim that I wanted Naomi to have a normal middle-class upbringing rather than the more privileged lifestyle the trust could provide. They'd been told that I was concerned about Naomi becoming spoiled or entitled, and that I'd requested the trust remain largely inactive until Naomi was older. None of this was true, of course. I'd never been contacted about any of these decisions. If I'd known about the trust, I would have wanted Naomi to have every advantage it could provide, especially regarding her healthcare and education. The thought that there were specialists I could have consulted earlier, treatments I could have afforded immediately, schools that could have provided better support during Naomi's illness, it was almost too painful to contemplate. Helen arranged a meeting with the Davis family's attorneys, and that conversation was both enlightening and emotionally complicated. Tom's parents, Naomi's paternal grandparents, had apparently been devastated when Tom walked away from his responsibilities. They'd wanted to maintain a relationship with Naomi but had been told by Megan that I preferred minimal contact to avoid confusing Naomi about her father's absence. The trust had been their way of ensuring Naomi would be provided for despite their son's failures as a father. They'd wanted to do right by their granddaughter even if their son wouldn't. Learning that their attempts to help had been perverted into a tool for exploitation by my own sister was almost as upsetting to them as it was to me. Naomi's grandfather, Robert Davis, actually called me personally to apologize for the way the trust had been mismanaged. "Ms. Morrison," he said, his voice heavy with regret, "we trusted the wrong intermediary to facilitate this arrangement. We should have insisted on direct contact with you from the beginning. Naomi is our granddaughter, and we failed her by allowing this situation to develop." It was a strange conversation, talking to the father of the man who had abandoned Naomi, but I could hear genuine remorse and concern in his voice. He and his wife wanted to meet Naomi, to be part of her life if I was comfortable with that arrangement. They wanted to make amends for their son's absence and ensure that Naomi knew she had family who cared about her. This added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Naomi had grown up believing her father's family wanted nothing to do with her. She'd sometimes ask why she didn't have grandparents like other kids, and I'd struggled to explain Tom's family's absence without completely villainizing them. Now I learned they'd been trying to be present in her life all along, and those attempts had been systematically blocked by Megan. The psychological impact of Megan's betrayal was something I was still processing. This wasn't just financial fraud, it was a complete violation of trust that had affected every aspect of our lives for 3 years. Every struggle we'd faced, every stress about money, every time I'd had to tell Naomi we couldn't afford something she wanted, every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about medical bills, all of it had been unnecessary. Megan had watched me work myself to exhaustion, had seen me lose weight from stress and lack of proper nutrition, had witnessed me break down crying when I thought Naomi wasn't looking, and she'd known the entire time that she could have ended our suffering by simply being honest about the trust. Instead, she'd chosen to profit from our pain. More shocking was the discovery that Megan had been forging documents related to the trust management, including monthly reports to the Davis family's lawyers and correspondence with property management companies. She'd created an entire fictional narrative where she was the authorized property manager for a trust that I supposedly managed, all while skimming money and benefits for herself. Helen also discovered that the reason the Davis family's lawyers had limited their contact attempts was because Megan had provided them with documentation showing my alleged desire for minimal involvement. She'd even gone so far as to create fake email accounts in my name to correspond with them, making it appear that I was actively involved in trust decisions when I knew nothing about them. The web of deception was so extensive that it took 2 forensic accountants 4 days to untangle everything. By the end of their investigation, we determined that Megan had stolen over $280,000 from Naomi's trust over the course of 3 years, not including the value of the free housing she'd provided herself. Naomi's condition had improved enough for her to come home, though she was still undergoing treatment. She was weak and tired, but her spirits were good, and the doctors were cautiously optimistic about her prognosis. I decided not to tell her about the trust or the money yet. She was 8 years old and fighting cancer, and she didn't need the additional stress of understanding how her aunt had betrayed us. Instead, I focused on preparing for what I privately called Revelation Day. Helen prepared all the legal documents, eviction notices, criminal complaints, cease and desist orders, and a civil lawsuit for the full amount of stolen money plus damages. We also prepared new management agreements for all the legitimate tenants in the buildings owned by Naomi's trust, ensuring that their rent would actually be reasonable and that they'd be protected from any future exploitation. I had Helen prepare everything in a black envelope, sealed with the Davis Holdings LLC logo that I'd never seen before but that Naomi was apparently entitled to use. The symbolism felt appropriate. Megan had tried to hand me what she thought was my financial death sentence with her lease documents, and now I was returning the favor. On the morning of March 15, exactly 1 month after Megan's cruel visit to the hospital, I knocked on the door of the Lincoln Park house that Naomi actually owned. Megan answered the door wearing a silk robe and holding a cup of expensive coffee, looking like she didn't have a care in the world. "Emily. What a surprise. I wasn't expecting you. How's Naomi doing?" Her voice was sickeningly sweet, like the previous month's confrontation had never happened. She was clearly expecting me to beg, to plead for mercy, to accept whatever terms she wanted to dictate. "Naomi's doing much better, thank you for asking," I replied calmly. "May I come in?" I have something for you. Megan's eyes lit up, probably thinking I was there to sign her extortionate lease agreement. Of course. Andrew's in his office. Andrew. She called out. Emily's here. Andrew appeared a moment later, wearing an expensive suit and looking like he was preparing for another day of whatever financial manipulation he did for work. Emily. Good to see you. I trust you've made a decision about the rent situation? I have, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out the black envelope. I think this will clarify everything. Megan took the envelope with a smug smile, probably expecting to see a signed lease agreement or a letter begging for more time. Instead, when she opened it and began reading, her face went through a re-Andrewable transformation. The smugness faded first, replaced by confusion, then disbelief, then genuine fear. What? What is this? She stammered, her voice suddenly shaky. Those are eviction notices, Megan. You have 30 days to vacate this property. You'll also find criminal complaints for fraud and forgery, a civil lawsuit for $280,000 in damages, and a cease and desist order requiring you to stop representing yourself as having any authority over Naomi's trust. Andrew snatched the papers from Megan's trembling hands and began reading. I watched his face go through the same progression of emotions, ending with what looked like genuine panic. This can't be right, he said, his voice much less confident than usual. Emily, you can't own these properties. You don't have this kind of money. You're right, I agreed. I don't have this kind of money. But Naomi does. Naomi has always had this money, money that was placed in trust for her 3 years ago. Money that Megan has been stealing while making me pay rent on property my daughter owns. Megan collapsed onto her expensive couch, her face pale and her hands shaking. Emily, I can explain. Can you explain why you've been forging documents related to Naomi's trust? Can you explain why you've been intercepting Naomi's mail and blocking contact from her grandparents? Can you explain why you stood outside my daughter's hospital room and demanded $6,000 in rent on property she owns? The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of lies and betrayal. Finally, Andrew tried to speak. Look, Emily, maybe we can work something out. Maybe there was some miscommunication. The only thing we're going to work out, I interrupted, is a payment plan for the $280,000 you've stolen from my daughter. Oh, and Andrew? You might want to call your lawyer. The forensic accountants found some interesting irregularities in how you've been handling the tax filings for properties you thought you were getting for free. That's when Megan started crying. Not the elegant tears of someone who was genuinely remorseful, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who had just realized the full extent of their situation. She was facing criminal charges, civil lawsuits, and the loss of a lifestyle she'd been living at my daughter's expense. Emily, please, she begged. I'm your sister. We're family. Naomi's my niece. I love her. If you loved Naomi, you wouldn't have stolen her inheritance. If you loved Naomi, you wouldn't have stood outside her hospital room and called her a financial burden. If you loved Naomi, you would have told me about the trusts so I could have gotten her better medical care instead of watching me stress about every medical bill. I stood up to leave, but turned back for one final statement. Megan, you're going to discover something interesting about family over the next few weeks. Real family doesn't steal from children. Real family doesn't exploit people when they're at their most vulnerable. Real family doesn't call sick kids financial burdens. You're about to learn the difference between being related to someone and actually being family. I walked out of that house, Naomi's house, feeling lighter than I had in years. Behind me, I could hear Megan sobbing and Andrew making frantic phone calls, probably to lawyers and accountants, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage from their years of theft and fraud. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Megan and Andrew were both charged with multiple felonies related to fraud and forgery. Megan eventually pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she still served 14 months in federal prison. Andrew faced additional charges related to tax fraud and served 20 months. The civil lawsuit was settled out of court when it became clear that they had no viable defense. They were ordered to pay back every penny they'd stolen, plus interest and damages. The house in Lincoln Park was sold to help cover the debt, along with their luxury cars and most of their other assets. Naomi's trust was restructured with proper oversight and transparency. Helen recommended a reputable wealth management firm that specializes in trusts for minors, and every decision is now made with Naomi's best interests in mind. The trust pays for the best possible medical care, ensuring that Naomi has access to any treatment she needs without the financial stress that had been weighing on me. More importantly, Naomi's prognosis has improved dramatically. With access to the best specialists and cutting-edge treatments, her cancer is now in remission. She's back in school, playing with friends, and acting like the happy, energetic 8-year-old she should be. She still doesn't know about the trust or the money. I want her to have as normal a childhood as possible, but she knows that the bad times are behind us. As for me, I've been able to focus entirely on Naomi's recovery without the constant stress of financial worry. I still work, because I love my job and want to maintain some sense of normalcy, but I no longer have to work overtime or take on extra shifts. I can be present for Naomi's treatments, her school events, and all the little moments that make childhood special. The most satisfying part of this entire experience wasn't the money or the legal victory, it was watching Megan's face when she realized that her years of lies and manipulation had finally caught up with her. She had tried to exploit my love for Naomi, to use my desperation as a mother to extract money from a trust that belonged to my daughter in the first place. Instead, her greed and cruelty led to the exposure of crimes that will follow her for the rest of her life. I've learned some valuable lessons from this experience. I've learned that family isn't defined by blood relationships, but by love, loyalty, and genuine care for one another. Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who sat with Naomi during her treatments, showed more genuine family love than Megan ever did. The nurses and doctors who fought to save Naomi's life were more family to us than the people who shared our DNA but not our values. I've also learned that justice, while sometimes slow, can be incredibly thorough. Megan thought she was clever, manipulating a grieving mother and stealing from a sick child. She thought she could hide behind family relationships and emotional manipulation to avoid consequences. Instead, every lie she told, every document she forged, every dollar she stole became evidence in a case that ultimately destroyed the life she'd built on deception. The building where we still live is now properly managed by professionals who work for Naomi's trust. The other tenants, who had been paying reasonable rents that were actually going to legitimate property management, received confirmation that their leases would continue under proper management. Everyone benefits from honest, transparent management instead of the exploitation that Megan had planned. Sometimes I wonder if Megan truly understood the magnitude of what she was doing. Did she realize that she was stealing from a child with cancer? Did she comprehend the additional stress and fear she was causing during the most difficult time in our lives? Or was she so consumed by greed and self-interest that she couldn't see past her own desires? I suppose it doesn't matter now. What matters is that Naomi is healthy and happy, that we have the resources to ensure she gets the best possible care, and that the people who tried to exploit our vulnerability faced real consequences for their actions. The black envelope I handed Megan that morning contained more than just legal documents, it contained justice, accountability, and the end of years of exploitation. She had tried to use Naomi's illness as leverage to extract money from us, but instead, her cruelty led to the discovery of her crimes and the restoration of what was rightfully Naomi's. Naomi is now 9 years old, cancer-free for 6 months, and starting to ask questions about why we suddenly have a different lifestyle. Soon, I'll have to explain about the trust, about her biological father's family, and about the legal battles that secured her future. But for now, I'm content to watch her play with her friends, excel in school, and dream about what she wants to be when she grows up. She talks about becoming a doctor someday, inspired by the medical team that saved her life. She wants to help other sick children the way she was helped. I have no doubt that Naomi will use her resources to make a positive difference in the world, the same way that positive people made a difference in her life when she needed it most. As for Megan, she'll be starting her prison sentence next month. I haven't spoken to her since that morning in March, and I don't plan to. Some betrayals are too deep, some cruelties too profound, to forgive or forget. She made her choices when she decided to exploit a dying child and her desperate mother. Now she gets to live with the consequences of those choices. The morning I handed her that black envelope was the morning she lost everything: her freedom, her financial security, her reputation, and her family. But it was also the morning that Naomi and I got our lives back, our future secured, and our faith in justice restored. Sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes it's about ensuring that the truth comes to light and that justice is served. Sometimes it's about protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually win.